Mainstream history draws a hard line at the edge of the continent. A single windswept camp on the coast of Newfoundland is the only place science agrees Norse explorers ever set foot in North America. Nothing, the record insists, ties them to the interior. Then there is the farm in western Minnesota. In 1898, in the roots of an old aspen tree, a plow blade caught on a slab of gray stone carved with an alphabet that had no business being on an American field. Scandinavian runes, 2,400 kilometers inland. More than a century later, the field still cannot agree on what it is. This is not a story about a cover-up. It is a story about evidence that points in more than one direction at once. Some of what follows is solid, some is disputed. One thread is a dead end. Keeping them apart is the whole problem. To understand why a carved stone in Minnesota is so difficult to place, you first have to understand the one place science has agreed on. It sits at the northern tip of Newfoundland, a stretch of coast called Lawns o' Meadows. It is the edge of the continent in every sense that matters. Treeless, battered by Atlantic wind, the kind of place a sailor reaches and knows they have come to the end of something. Excavation began there in the 1960s, led by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stine Ingstad. What they lifted out of the turf did not echo anything native to the Americas. Beneath the grass lay the outlines of 8 buildings, halls, workshops, outbuildings, laid out in the manner of Greenland and Iceland. The artifacts left little room for argument, ring-headed bronze pins of the kind used to fasten a Norse cloak, spindle whorls for textile work, fragments of iron nails. Then, in one of the outbuildings, the detail that settled the matter, a bloomery furnace, heaps of iron slag, the residue of people smelting iron from local ore, repairing ships, making tools. This was not a landing. It was a working base, equipped and operational. For decades, the timing stayed frustratingly loose. Radiocarbon placed the activity somewhere between 990 and 1050 of the Common Era, a window 60 years wide. Then, in 2021, a team led by chronologists at the University of Groningen closed it. In the year 992, a solar storm struck the Earth and drove a sudden pulse of radioactive carbon into the atmosphere, a spike that trees everywhere absorbed into the ring they grew the following year. The researchers found 3 pieces of wood at the site, all cut with metal blades the local population did not possess, all carrying that signal exactly 29 growth rings in from the bark. The wood had been felled in the year 1021, exactly 1,000 years ago, 471 years before Columbus. The date is not disputed. It is one of the most precise in the whole of North American archaeology. And here is where the accepted story begins to feel incomplete. For all the material pulled from the ground, there were no graves, no cemeteries, almost no personal belongings, no clear evidence of women living there in any number, and none of children. There was, in short, no evidence of a colony. Brigida Wallace, who spent decades excavating the site for Parks Canada, has been plain about what it actually was. A base, a seasonal outpost, a place to beach a ship, mend a hull, smelt iron, and prepare for the next leg of a journey. The settlers stayed a few years, and then they left, which raises the question the discipline has never answered to its own satisfaction. If Lawns o' Meadows was only a base, where were the people using it actually going? You do not cross an ocean in a wooden ship, build a forge, and repair vessels at the margin of an unknown continent because you mean to sit on the beach for a decade. You do that because you intend to go further. The camp was a threshold, not a destination. And beyond it, the rivers ran thousands of kilometers into the interior of a continent the Norse were, by every measure of skill they possessed, equipped to enter. The record agrees on the camp. It does not agree on what happened after. That silence is where the stone comes in. Move the story west, off the coast, and into the middle of the continent, to a farm in Douglas County in the rolling country of western Minnesota. The year is 1898. A Swedish immigrant named Olof Oman is clearing land to plant crops. His plow catches on something solid, lodged in the roots of an old aspen tree. He digs it out. What comes up is a slab of gray stone, the kind geologists call greywacke. It weighs roughly 200 pounds. It is shaped, more or less, like a gravestone. And carved into its flat face and along one of its edges, in an alphabet that has no business being on an American farm, are runes. Scandinavian runes. The kind used by Norse explorers centuries before any European was supposed to have reached the interior of North America. The inscription was eventually translated, and what it recorded stopped people where they stood. It describes a party of Götar and Norwegians on a journey of exploration, traveling from Vinland westward. It gives a camp, set a day's journey north of the stone, beside two rocky islands. It describes men going out to fish and returning to find 10 of their number dead. It ends with a short line asking for deliverance from evil. And then, cut into the rock, a number. 1362. Let that settle for a moment. 1362. 130 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean. In central Minnesota. 2,400 kilometers from the only Norse camp science has ever accepted, someone had apparently left a dated account of an expedition, a death toll, and a plea, written in the letters of a people the record places on the coast and nowhere else. If the stone was what it appeared to be, it did not merely extend the map of the Norse in America. It tore it up. From the moment it surfaced, the stone became the center of one of the longest-running archaeological disputes on the continent, and it has stayed there for more than a century. It has been called one of the most important artifacts ever found in the New World. It has also been called one of the most elaborate hoaxes ever attempted. Both claims have been made in earnest, by serious people, about the same 200 pounds of rock. Consider what the discovery actually was, stripped of the argument around it. A physical object, carved with genuine skill, whoever held the chisel. A quantity of Scandinavian runes far too large to be an accident or a scratch. A specific narrative, with a place, a number of men, and a cause of death. And a precise year, cut into the stone as deliberately as everything else. This is not a vague marking that invites projection. It is a text. It says something. That is exactly what makes it so difficult. A forgery. This detail would require not just a carver, but a story, a plausible medieval date, and a command of runic writing rare in a Minnesota farming county in the 1890s. An authentic inscription would require rewriting where the Norse went and how far. Neither explanation is cheap. Each one demands that you believe something the evidence does not hand over freely. So the question is not whether the stone is interesting. It plainly is. The question is, which of those two costly explanations is true, and the field committed to one of them faster than the evidence alone can account for. Understanding why the verdict came down so quickly and why it hardened is the next part of the story. The verdict came down on the side of forgery, and it came down hard. The overwhelming weight of scholarship holds that the Kensington inscription was carved not in the 14th century but in the late 19th, most likely by a Scandinavian immigrant living in the region where it was found. That has been the mainstream position for more than 100 years, and it has barely shifted. The core of the case is not geological, it is linguistic. The runes and the words carved into the stone do not sit comfortably in the 1300s. Certain rune forms used in the inscription are not attested in medieval Scandinavia at all. Certain words look far too modern. Henrik Williams, a professor at Uppsala and one of the leading living authorities on runic writing, has pointed to the word rendered as opthagelsefarth, meaning a journey of exploration or discovery. There is no known medieval form of it. It appears instead to be lifted from modern Danish. The language of the inscription, taken as a whole, reads closer to the Swedish spoken in the 1880s than to anything a 14th century traveler would have written. Williams has stated the conclusion plainly. No scientific evidence of any kind supports a 14th century date. That is the technical case. But a technical case does not explain how fast the verdict formed or why it set so firmly, and here the story becomes structural rather than personal. The stone surfaced in 1898 at the absolute peak of Scandinavian immigration into the American Midwest. Thousands of Swedes and Norwegians were arriving in Minnesota every year, breaking sod, raising barns, building churches, and looking for a foothold in a country that did not always want them. The historian David Kruger has written at length about what the stone offered those communities. Here was an artifact that seemed to prove their ancestors had stood on this land first, centuries before the English, before the French, before Columbus. For people being pressed to assimilate and abandon their language, that was not a curiosity, it was a claim to belonging. Mainstream scholars watched that enthusiasm build and grew suspicious, not only of the stone, but of the people who so badly wanted it to be real. The suspicion hardened into a default. The stone was assumed to be a forgery meant to flatter immigrant pride, and once that assumption was in place, the discipline largely stopped examining the object with open eyes. The question had been answered before it was fully asked. None of that makes the establishment wrong. The linguistic evidence is genuinely difficult to explain away, and difficult in exactly the direction that points to a modern hand. But it is worth being honest that the verdict was reached partly for reasons that had nothing to do with runes, and that a conclusion arrived at for the wrong reasons can still happen to be correct. There is also a complication that the forgery case has never fully absorbed. Testing of organic material associated with the stone suggested it had been in the ground for roughly 25 years before Ohman's plow found it. If that holds, it pushes the carving back before Ohman owned the farm, which means the man who dug it up may not have been the man who made it. That does not authenticate the inscription. It does unsettle the tidiest version of the hoax, the one where the finder and the forger are the same person. So the settled verdict is settled, and it rests on real evidence. But it was formed under pressure, and it leaves a loose thread it has never quite tied off. That thread is why the case has never actually died. The case has not died because two lines of inquiry keep pulling at it, one from the rock itself and one from the runes. Start with the rock. In the early 2000s, an American geologist named Scott Wolter conducted a petrographic analysis of the inscribed surface, examining the weathering of mica crystals exposed inside the carved grooves. His argument was that the chemical breakdown of those minerals would have taken time, a great deal of it. At least 2 centuries of burial, on his reading, before the stone ever reached the surface. If that were true, the carving could not have been made in the 1890s. It would already have been old, by generations, when Ohman's plow struck it. It is important to be precise about how that argument has been received. Mainstream geology and archaeology rejected Wolter's conclusion. Wolter himself is a contested figure, better known to many for television than for peer review, and his interpretations have drawn sustained criticism. But it is also true that no refutation of comparable depth has closed the geological question to everyone's satisfaction. The claim was dismissed more than it was dismantled. That is a real distinction, and it is the kind of gap in which a dispute survives. Then there is the rhenology, and here the ground is more careful. Henrik Williams, the same Uppsala rhenologist who says no evidence supports a 14th century date, has nonetheless argued that some of the early dismissals were too hasty. He has pointed out that the case for a 19th century origin, while strong, is not actually complete. He has identified examples of rune usage in medieval Scandinavia that the linguists who condemned the stone in 1910 did not have in front of them. He has not authenticated the inscription. He has been explicit that he does not. But he has treated the question as open at the edges rather than shut, and newer work using three-dimensional imaging of the carved surface, conducted in collaboration with the researcher Richard Nielsen, has continued to test it rather than file it away. Nielsen belongs to a small minority of researchers who have defended a medieval date on linguistic grounds. It is a minority, and it should be named as one. But a minority position held by credentialed people who keep publishing is not the same thing as a settled falsehood, and the honest description of the rhonology is that the mainstream verdict stands while a serious few continue to press against it. This is the part that requires holding two ideas at once. At the level of consensus, the stone is a forgery, and the linguistic evidence for that is genuinely hard to overcome. At the level of live inquiry, the question is not entirely closed. Those are different claims about different things. A field can be right about where the weight of evidence sits and still leave a door ajar, and a careful listener should not mistake the open door for a change in the weight. What keeps the Kensington stone alive, then, is not a smoking gun. No one has produced the analysis that flips the verdict. What keeps it alive is that every attempt to seal the case completely has left a small, stubborn margin in the mineral weathering that was rejected rather than resolved, and in a leading rhonologist's own admission that the modern forgery case is not airtight, and the stone has never had to stand entirely alone. Scattered around it, across the same interior the inscription describes, sits a loose collection of other objects, other routes, and other memories. Taken one at a time, each is easy to set aside. Taken together, they are harder. Take them one at a time, because separately is how they are usually dismissed. Begin with the coin. In 1957, at a coastal site in Maine known as the Götar site, an amateur excavator recovered a small, worn silver penny from the remains of a Native American settlement. It was misidentified at first. 2 decades later, a Norwegian numismatist confirmed what it actually was: a genuine Norse coin struck during the reign of Olaf Kyrre, King of Norway, between roughly 1065 and 1080. There is no serious doubt about the coin itself. It is real, it is Norse, and it was in American soil. The difficulty is the journey, not the object. The settlement where it was found dates to around 1180 to 1235, well after the Norse camps in North America were abandoned. The mainstream explanation is that the coin traveled through indigenous trade networks, passing hand to hand across the continent before it was lost. Some scholars go further and question the find itself, whether the coin was truly excavated where it was said to be, a real object, an unexplained path, not a Viking standing on a beach in Maine. Then the tools. Across Minnesota and Wisconsin, farmers and amateurs have for over a century reported iron objects pulled from fields and riverbanks, axes and blades of a design that does not match the implements later European traders brought. The honest problem is documentation. Almost none of these finds carry the provenance needed to separate a medieval artifact from a later trade good imitating an older style, and mainstream archaeology has used that uncertainty to set the whole category aside. What resists a clean dismissal is the geography. The objects keep surfacing along the same river corridors, the same waterways, again and again, which brings in the roots. The Viking longship drew less than a meter of water. A vessel built to cross the open Atlantic could also work up shallow rivers and slip across lakes that would ground a deeper hull. When the water ran out, the Norse carried their boats overland, a technique called portage, and this was not improvised in America. The Varangians, Norse traders, and warriors had spent generations threading shallow draft ships through the rivers of Russia, moving between the Baltic and the Black Sea across thousands of kilometers of inland water. The skill was already in the tradition, and the geography cooperates. One corridor runs from Hudson Bay down the Nelson River into Lake Winnipeg and south along the Red River toward Minnesota. Another runs from the St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes to Superior. 500 years later, French voyageurs used nearly identical routes, following trails indigenous nations had maintained for generations. The roads through the continent were already there, but a road establishes possibility, not occurrence. That a Norse crew could have reached Minnesota by water is not evidence that one did. Last, the memory. Dakota and Ojibwe oral traditions carry accounts of pale strangers who arrived by water before the French or the English, in boats that moved along the rivers. This is the thread Western archaeology has been slowest to weigh, and its record on that count is not good. Indigenous oral histories elsewhere have been shown repeatedly to preserve real events across centuries, but these particular accounts do not name the Norse and do not fix a date. They corroborate a pattern. They do not prove a people. So each thread alone can be set down. Together, they form a pattern that has been harder to wave off with every passing decade. And a pattern is exactly the thing modern science has been trying, and mostly failing, to turn into proof. Modern science is what a pattern eventually runs into, and it is worth being exact about what it can and cannot do here. Start with what it can. The dating of Lance au Meadows to a single year, 1021, is the proof of concept. A generation ago, that camp floated inside a 60-year window. Then a method arrived, reading a solar storm's fingerprint out of tree rings, and closed the window to 12 months. That is the field getting sharper in real time, turning a vague estimate into a fixed point. It is the standard the Minnesota question is now measured against, and it is a high one. There is also a genuinely tailor-made new tool that sounds tailor-made for this kind of mystery: sedimentary ancient DNA. Every living thing sheds genetic material constantly, and some of it settles into the mud at the bottom of undisturbed lakes, where the cold can preserve it for thousands of years. Drill down through those layers, sequence what is locked inside, and you can begin to read a record of who and what lived near the water and roughly when. The technique is real and maturing quickly. The large genomic studies of the Viking world, sequencing hundreds of ancient individuals across Europe and the North Atlantic, are real science, published and peer-reviewed. Now the necessary honesty, because this is where the story is most often oversold. There is no peer-reviewed finding of Scandinavian DNA in Minnesota lake sediment. Claims that such a discovery has been made, that markers of medieval northern Europe have been pulled from a quiet Minnesota lake, should be treated as unverified. The method exists. A specific Minnesota result does not sit anywhere in the scientific record. It is important not to let a real technique lend its credibility to a finding that has not been produced. What the science does supply is context, and the context is not trivial. The window in which the sagas place Norse voyages and in which Lance au Meadows was active coincides with the medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250. Tree rings and Greenland ice cores confirm that during those centuries the North Atlantic grew warmer, sea ice retreated, and summers lengthened. The route toward Hudson Bay opened more often. Rivers in the interior ran higher, portages grew less punishing. For a few hundred years, the land itself was more open to long-distance travel than at almost any other time. That does not put a Norse crew in Minnesota. It makes the question a legitimate one rather than a fantasy, and it sets the bar plainly. Rewriting 1,000 years of accepted history would take something the interior has never yielded: a Norse burial, a sealed camp, a datable artifact paired with unambiguous Scandinavian material in undisturbed ground. None of that has been found in Minnesota. The stone is contested. The coin is coastal and unexplained. The tools lack provenance. The memory does not name names. What has actually changed is not the evidence. It is who is handling the question. This has moved out of the hands of weekend enthusiasts and immigrant pride and into peer-reviewed laboratories, examined with methods that did not exist a generation ago. The inquiry has become more rigorous. It has not become more conclusive. So the honest peak of this story is not that Vikings reached Minnesota. On the evidence, the answer to that remains no confirmed trace. The honest peak is the older question the accepted camp itself never closed. Lonsos Meadows proves the Norse crossed to this continent and then went somewhere. How far that reach extended, no one can yet say. Return to the objects, because they are what remain. The stone is in a museum. The coin is real. The rivers were navigable. The sagas describe more than one camp. Separate what is established from what is not. Established. One confirmed Norse site, dated to a single year. A genuine coin whose path across a continent no one can trace. An inscription the field overwhelmingly reads as a forgery and still cannot make everyone stop questioning. Not established. That any Norse foot ever touched Minnesota soil. The discovery leaves archaeologists without a final answer, and not because the evidence is hidden. It is because the evidence that exists points in more than one direction, and the single piece that would settle it has never been found. The rivers are still there. The sediment is still there. The stone is still in its case. The questions they hold have outlasted everyone who has tried to close them.